Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, fine as asked. This is Battlefield 1. In today's weapon review, we're revisiting the RSC 1917 factory because it, of course, has seen quite a substantial buff in the recent Time to Kill patch, accompanied, of course, by the North Sea update. Now, we're going to be looking at the stats of the weapon in question here, how it performs, how it compares to the different variants of itself available, and, of course, other weapons available on the battlefield. And last, but certainly not least, we're going to be talking about how to get the most out of this weapon when using it on the battlefield. Starting off then with the stats of this weapon. With a maximum damage of 53 and a minimum damage of 38, there's no doubt that this is the hardest hitting SLR in the game. This allows you to two-shot kill your enemies all the way out to 70 meters, from which point onwards you're going to require 3 body shots to actually down your target. Accompanying this, a relatively slow fire rate, although of course slightly higher than it previously was at 179 rounds per minute, a decent muzzle velocity at 720 meters per second, and a not actually as bad as you may think magazine size of 6. Now you do have to consider, while 6 bullets is most definitely not a lot, it is more than it initially seems, because of course you only require 2 bullets per target, comparable to most of the 10 round SLRs available, such as the Rigotti, if you think about how many targets you can actually down with a single magazine. Now moving on from the magazine size to the amount of time it's going to take you to reload it. Now arguably not that long. On the other hand, because you're reloading this weapon quite frequently, it can be a little bit tedious from time to time, with a short reload of 2.7 seconds and a long reload of 3.3. Recoil, substantially less than it previously was, notable nevertheless still, at 1.5 vertical and 0.9 horizontal, that is to the left and right, with of course a non-existent first shot recoil multiplier of 1, meaning this weapon has of course no first shot kick. Moving over to the accuracy, the spread values of this weapon, we're looking at the factory variant here specifically. It comes in with a base ADS, that's while aiming down sight and not moving, of 0.15, an ADS while moving of 1.05, and hipfire, typically bad for SLRs, which are of course not trench variants, at 3. Overall, if you then look at the spread increase per shot at 0.1 and the spread decrease of this weapon, which is at 6 degrees per second, we can figure out that its maximum fire rate, while maintaining minimum spread, is actually very close to its maximum fire rate overall. This of course being a general change introduced by the Time to Kill patch. In this specific case, with this specific weapon, it means that if you want to fire this weapon at its maximum accurate state with its minimum spread, you're going to be looking at a fire rate of around about 167, 168 rounds per minute, allowing you most definitely within its 70 meter 2-shot kill radius to do some serious damage against most opponents. Now with the stats out of the way, there is of course a second version of the RSC 1917, the Optical variant. It of course comes with a few quite noticeable differences to the factory variant, or at least one most definitely worth pointing out, and that is of course the factory versus Optical trade-off. One, the factory is an iron sights, and the Optical version has of course an optics. Now I personally prefer the factory version simply because of its iron sights over the Optical preset, because the Optical preset in my opinion is just a little bit too intrusive on exactly how much you can see. Furthermore, I find the iron sights a little bit easier to actually be accurate with when trying to take out targets. That is, however, not the only difference that these two weapons have over each other. The Optical variant has slightly worse recoil decrease, not that this is generally a noticeable difference, but it is actually more accurate as well, coming in with a base ADS of 0.112 versus the 0.15 of the factory variant, and an accuracy while moving and aiming down sight of 0.788 versus the 105 found on the factory variant. The last difference, although arguably not really worth mentioning, is that it has a lower spread increase per shot, at the same time however a lower spread decrease, meaning that both of these weapons are actually capable of performing the same maximum fire rate and minimum spread, but if you max out the fire rate of this weapon completely, you'll gain spread slightly slower with the Optical variant compared to the factory variant. Now, having compared the two, they are obviously quite similar. It is generally a matter of preference of sight, really, when it comes to choosing between these two weapons, whether you prefer an optical sight or iron sights. Other than that, the differences aren't really too noticeable. So how does the weapon then perform against other SLRs, and more importantly the new competition, the long range LMGs and of course the close quarter SMGs and LMGs with their better damage? Well, SLRs really have been pushed out of the close quarter scenario, the close quarter combat field, and that's simply because even these weapons, these extremely high damaging weapons such as the Outloading 835 or of course the RSC, can't really keep up when it comes to DPS on target anymore. They simply don't have the damage to rival something like a Hellriegel, let alone, of course, the necessary ease of use. So a Hellriegel comes in with a time to kill in close quarters of around about 280 milliseconds, and that's relatively easy to achieve. If you miss a shot, your time to kill isn't too much worse. You just have to plant another. You're firing an automatic weapon, no big deal. The same, of course, cannot be said for the RSC, which already comes in at a worse time to kill at 340 milliseconds, roughly, in close quarter combat. So you're very much relegated here, as with most SLRs, to the more medium range engagements if you want to have an advantage from a weapon perspective on your enemy. And I really would recommend sticking to that medium range when it comes to the RSC, more than you would with some of the other SLRs, which are still more easy to use in close quarter. And that is simply because you have a low fire rate and a more or less constrained magazine, meaning that if you miss a couple of shots, really you're putting yourself at a huge disadvantage to the point where you're likely going to get killed. Now, if you get into close quarter, this weapon can absolutely hold its own. It just requires essentially a 100% accuracy rating on you if you're fighting an opponent that is actually aware of your position. As such, this weapon is more of a medium range passive weapon, or a weapon to be used aggressively if you know exactly where your enemies are coming from and you can essentially pre-line up your iron sights and hit every shot perfectly. It very much can be a clutch weapon to use. At the same time, if you want reliable usage out of, a medium range approach to this is likely the better way. Now, how it compares to some of the other more skill cannon orientated SLRs, well, its direct competitor, of course, is the auto-loading 835, and it comes, of course, with some very different stats. Interesting enough, however, the same sub 70 meter ideal engagement distance and the same time to kill within that engagement distance. What differentiates these weapons now is essentially that one fires extremely fast but is only really capable of taking on one target per magazine. The other fires very slow while still putting out the same damage per second, but is capable of taking on maybe a few more targets thanks to its, relatively speaking to the amount of bullets it takes to down a target, larger magazine. An interesting comparison between these two weapons could be made, and I'll have to save that for a later video if you want me to talk about that. What can be said for the RSC, however, if you are a methodical player, if you are all about that proactive and not reactive playstyle, this is a absolutely fantastic weapon. And balance-wise, it's clearly one of the strongest SLRs in the game right now, if not even the best one out there. It's not impossible to use, yet not easy to use, so it's gonna take some practice. But as per usual for these slightly higher skill tier weapons, if you're willing to put in the effort, you're willing to put in the time, you most definitely are going to be rewarded. With that being said, I'd like to hear your opinion on the RSC on this video, your experiences. Leave those, of course, as well as your usual video suggestions down below in the comments, or hit me up with them on Twitter. If you enjoyed the video, found it helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. But with all that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 1 video.